Hey, it's great to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Today I'm going to be helping you understand the Olivet Discourse. We're going to begin that process. Now, if you're like me, for many years as I was a Christian, I really wrestled with how to understand the Olivet Discourse, particularly Matthew 24, because on the one hand, there seemed to be signs that you could know, but on the other hand, there were no signs that you could know. And so if the Olivet Discourse has been a riddle to you, I'm going to be helping you out. Now, last time we were together, I gave you an assignment to look at the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and look at the section where all the signs are. Well, today that's going to bear fruit. I'm going to explain why. Today I'm going to begin with Matthew 23. What I'm going to do is start setting up the context for interpreting the Olivet Discourse. We're going to spend many sessions in understanding the Olivet Discourse, particularly in Matthew 24. And what I'm going to show you is once you understand the layout, the structure, and the interpretive principles of the Olivet Discourse, I'm telling you, you're going to be blown away. It's going to revolutionize the way you understand eschatology, and you will kind of look back at what you used to think, and you realize it was deficient. That's what happened to me many years ago when I was tasked by a church to look into these things, and I had copious amounts of time to look at the Greek and the grammar, syntax, read journal articles, etc. I'm going to be sharing that research with you. So today, buckle up your seat. We're going to be doing many sessions. I'll go as fast as I can because I don't want to keep you, for hours on this topic. I'll try to keep my messages as short as possible, but let's get started. Let's look at Matthew 23. Matthew 23 is, in fact, the context for Matthew 24 and the Olivet Discourse. So let's look at what happened. I want you to remember that in Matthew 23, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees and the scribes because they are the religious leaders of Israel. They represent the people, and yet they don't believe in the Messiah, and they are no different than those who had gone before them for generations who distrusted God, hated the prophets of God, and mistreated and even killed the prophets. So Jesus excoriates them for their lack of trust, their lack of faith, their lack of belief in the way they acted in the temple just prior to his Olivet Discourse. And so look at Jesus' rebuke in the temple. And I can't even cover it all. I'm just going to be covering verses 31 through 39, but that'll be sufficient to lay out the groundwork for the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. So again, as we pick up here in verse 31, I'll pull up my pointer here. Remember, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees, the scribes, the leadership of Israel in their temple. Notice Jesus here in verse 31 is talking about how they are those who murdered the prophets. He says, "So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, with those final words, Jesus left the temple, and he really never came back. Their temple was left to them desolate. Okay? Now, what I want to do is start in the very beginning, and I want to explain some very significant things that Jesus is rebuking the leadership of Israel for. First of all, notice it says, "You are sons of those who murdered the prophets." When Jesus says you are the sons of those who murder the prophets, what he means is that they are in solidarity. There's something called corporate solidarity, in which they are characterized by the same sinful hatred of God's prophets as those of old in Israel who used to murder the prophets. So to be a son of something, oftentimes in the New Testament, means to be characterized by. Let me give you some examples. For example, in Mark 3:17, remember, James and John are called the sons of thunder by Jesus. What does that mean? It means they were characterized by a boisterous nature. Think about those who are godly in Luke 6:35 are called sons of the Most High. Okay, what does it mean? They're characterized by godliness. The unregenerate and unbelievers are those who don't believe and therefore they don't obey. They're called the sons of disobedience in Ephesians 2:2. Why? Because their lives are characterized by disobedience. And so the idea then is that the leadership of Israel was characterized by the same hatred and the murder of God's prophets as those who had gone before who murdered the prophets. Okay, like the one, as you're going to see, who killed and murdered the son of Zechariah some 520 years earlier. I'm sorry, the son of Berechiah, which is Zechariah the prophet. Okay, now why is this important? Well, as Jesus is talking about them as those who murdered the prophets, remember who Jesus is. Jesus is the prophet par excellence. He is the one that Moses had predicted would come about. Remember in Deuteronomy 18:15, if you're a note taker, jot that down. Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses predicted that God would raise up a prophet like himself. Why is that important? Because not only was Moses a prophet, he was the mediator of a covenant. Okay, so the prophet to come was also going to be a mediator of the new covenant. And remember in Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses says, if you won't listen to him, it'll be required of you. So literally at the end of his verse, I don't have it in front of me, but Deuteronomy 18:15, he says, listen to him. What's very interesting is that is quoted in Matthew 17, I believe it's verse 5, if I remember, on the Mount of Transfiguration. The Mount of Transfiguration is a foreshadowing of Christ's parousia, his second coming. So Christ is glorified. Remember, there are three disciples, Peter, James, and John. Peter doesn't know what to say. He says, maybe we should build a tabernacle, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. Because remember, Moses and Elijah were also up on the mountain. Well, as he said that, all of a sudden a cloud overshadowed them. That's the glory of God. And there was a voice from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Now, why did God say that? Because he's linking Jesus to the prophet that Moses had foretold of in Deuteronomy 18:15. Why am I mentioning this? Because Jesus is the prophet par excellence who comes from God, and he's going to be murdered by the religious leaders of Israel. And so they're showing themselves no different than those who had gone before, who murdered people like the prophet Zechariah 500 and some years earlier. Okay, now why am I laboring this point? Because this explains what this generation is about. The preterist will tell you this generation has to do with people who are contemporaries of Jesus, and that this generation is only about a 70 to 80 year window of people who lived during Jesus' time. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Why? Well, notice the generation is linked to those who murdered the prophets. Okay, namely, yes, the scribes and the Pharisees in Jesus' day, but also those who shed the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Notice how Jesus says, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. The Jews in Jesus' day that didn't believe, that is the leaders of Israel, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're in corporate solidarity. Let's ask ourselves the question. Were the Pharisees and the scribes in Jesus' day alive 520 years earlier to murder Zechariah, the son of Berechiah? Jesus says, whom you murdered. No, the point is, they are all part of this generation. So the idea of this generation is it doesn't matter if you murdered Abel at the beginning of Genesis, or you murder Zechariah, the son of Berechiah at the end of the Old Testament era, or you kill Jesus, the prophet par excellence. If you hate the promises of God and murder the prophets, you're part of this generation. That's how Jesus is using it. It's a pejorative. Why is that important? Don't glaze over. Listen carefully. That tells you that this generation isn't about a 70 to 80 year window, and therefore everything had to be fulfilled in 70 AD as the preterist does. They're not reading the text. If this generation means everything had to happen within 70 to 80 years, why is Jesus accusing this generation of murdering Zechariah 520 years earlier? It disproves anyone who claims that this generation is only about a 70 to 80 year window of people that lived during the time of Jesus and after. It's nonsense. They're not reading the text carefully. Now, the other thing I want to point out is notice in verse 38, Jesus says as he's leaving them, the temple, he says, behold, your house is left to you desolate. The term left there is apheami, exceedingly important. If you're a note taker, write this down. Apheami. If you're to transliterate it from Greek to English, it would be aphemi. That's how I would write it, apheami. Now, what does apheami mean? It means to be left or abandoned. Now, why is that important? Because it's going to be used in the Olivet Discourse in a rapture passage. Listen carefully. Don't glaze over. Matthew 24:40, Jesus will talk about two men in the field. One is taken and the other is left. Okay, the same term is used, apheami. They're abandoned. Why is that important? Because you're going to hear YouTube video after YouTube video after YouTube video of people who don't get it. What they're going to tell you is that the person that's left is the one who is saved, and the one who is taken is the one who's taken in judgment. I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, they have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm going to be showing you when we get to that passage, but think about it this way. If Jesus used apheami, or Matthew did, for Jesus leaving the temple desolate and abandoned to destruction, do you think it's likely that Matthew is going to use the same term apheami for abandonment of God's people in an eschatological rapture passage in Matthew 24:40? Of course not. Of course not. And what's more, the term for received, remember in Matthew 24:40, there's two men in a field, one is taken and one is left. The one that's left is abandoned to judgment, just like the temple. But the one who's taken, the term is paralambano. It's the very same term Jesus uses in the upper room discourse in John 14, verse 3, when he says, I'll receive you to myself. Remember, he says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I go to prepare a place for you. And he says, if I go to prepare a place for you, I'm going to come again to receive you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. The term receive is paralambano. It's the same term that's used in Matthew 24:40 for the one that's taken. Okay, why? Because they're taken to Christ. It's paralambano literally means to be received alongside. It's a tender term for the care of God's people. So what I'm doing is I'm making connections for you. I'm making connections that you won't see if you're just an English reader. Okay, so the idea then of left is the idea of abandonment, and later in the rapture passage in Matthew 24:40, the one who is left behind is abandoned to judgment, just like the temple was. Okay, don't let people confuse you. They'll say all sorts of things. They don't know what they're talking about. And I say that boldly, but I'm not being arrogant. I'll prove it all through Scripture. Okay, let's go to verse 39. Exceedingly significant. This is what I want to show you. That as Jesus comes out of Matthew 23, out of the temple, he is setting us up to expect his return. You have to take that into the interpretation of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. If you do not, you're going to be led astray. Okay, and I'll explain why. Notice Jesus says, again, he's just passed judgment upon the temple. It's left abandoned, remember, apheami, desolate. But then he says, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about this idea of what you see in blue here, where it says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That actually comes from Psalm 118:26. And I believe that Psalm 118:26 was actually written during the time that the temple was rededicated, that is the second temple, in 515 BC. That's when I believe it happened. So you can read about that in Ezra chapter 6. Now, the reason I want to focus on this is what I believe is Jesus is citing here Psalm 118:26, which is a messianic psalm. Psalm 118 is called a Hallel psalm. From Psalm 113 all the way to Psalm 118, you have something called the Egyptian Hallel. And in this particular psalm, when the temple was dedicated, what would happen is the Israelites started celebrating their feasts, like the Feast of Tabernacles, and so, or Passover, for example. And this psalm would be sung just as Jesus and his disciples did at the Passover as well. And what it anticipated certainly was those who came to worship God in the temple, but ultimately it anticipated the Messiah, the one who would come in the name of Yahweh. Now, focus carefully with me. Notice what it says, blessed is he who comes. Literally, it's the one who comes. That is a messianic motif that begins, I believe, in Genesis 49:10. So jot down Genesis 49:10 if you're a note taker. Why is that important? Because in Genesis 49:10, the promise that was the Messiah, remember in Genesis, the Messiah is going to come from Abraham. Then he's going to, remember Genesis 15, then he's going to come from Isaac and then Jacob. Well, when you get to Genesis 49:10, you see the seed promise, that is the Messiah, is going to come from Judah. So of the 12 tribes of Israel, what tribe was going to have the Messiah? Judah. You read about that in Genesis 49:10. Let me read it to you. I've got that in my notes. Genesis 49:10, it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. The nations will obey him. I think that's the best reading of the text. So literally you have this phrase, the one who comes. Who is the coming one, or the one who comes? He's the Messiah. Now, proof of this is, remember in Matthew 11, John the Baptist is about to be beheaded. He's fearing for his life, and he is a human being. Yes, he's a believer, but he has a moment of doubt. And so he sends his messengers back to say to Jesus, are you really the one who comes? That's literally the participle that's used. Are you the coming one, or should we look for another? What was he citing? He's citing Psalm 118:26. He's citing Genesis 49:10 and Isaiah 59:20, which talks about the Redeemer who will come to Zion and who will turn transgression from Jacob. Okay, so the point is, there's this rich history. Sorry, my nose is itching. I've got allergies in my office. I'm sorry, I don't know why. I'm always allergic to something in here. But the point is, what John the Baptist was asking is, are you the Messiah? Or should we look for another? And remember, Jesus cites Isaiah 35, that the deaf hear, the blind see, the lame leap like a deer, and the good news of the gospel is preached to the poor. So he cites Isaiah 35, Isaiah 61. His fulfillment of those things is proof that he's the Messiah. Okay, but again, the point is in Matthew 11, the question from John the Baptist to Jesus regarding are you the Messiah is literally, are you the one who comes? Why is that important? Because this is a messianic psalm. What Jesus is saying is that the leadership of Israel in the temple will not see him again until they say he's the Messiah, that they recognize him. Now, this is very important because there's an important until, haos in the Greek, and it's real. Remember my great friend, scholar, pastor Bob DeWay often has said that until cannot be used for a non-event. If you see an until, it's referring to something that will one day occur. Okay, so what Jesus is claiming is that he will return someday, but he won't until what? They recognize that he's the Messiah. The great promise that Paul gives in Romans 11, 25 through 26 is that one day all Israel will come to faith. That's the great promise. And one day they will trust in the Messiah. That's what Zechariah 12:10 promised. That one day, and it's still in our future, God will pour out a spirit of supplication, meaning they will turn to the Lord and they will mourn for the one whom they've pierced, as one mourns for an only child. The mourning in Zechariah 12:10 of the one whom they've pierced, we know that's the Messiah, means a mourning of repentance. Remember, repentance and faith are two sides of the same coin. If you repent, you're repenting unto faith, and if you have faith, it's because you repented. So national repentance means they're coming to faith in whom? The Messiah. Zechariah 12:10 predicts that. By the way, what happens at Zechariah 14? Zechariah 12 to 14 is a unit. Zechariah 14, the Messiah returns to set up his kingdom. That's what it's about. So that's what, let's connect the dots. Jesus is saying that they would not see him until they recognize him as the Messiah. One day in the future, we don't know when this time period in the 70th week of Daniel, we have no idea when this will come. But one day in our future, it could be tomorrow, it could be we have no idea. It could be 100 years from now. But the 70th week of Daniel will break forth, and it's at that time that Israel will recognize their Messiah. And therefore Jesus will come back to his temple. Okay? Now, very important that we see this connection with the glory of God in the temple. This is exceedingly important. Let me show you what's going on. Recall in Ezekiel 11:23 that in the past you have the Lord, his glory, leaving the temple because of the idolatry of Israel. You see that in Ezekiel 11:23. It says, "The glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain which is east of the city." Now, why is this important? Because of the idolatry of Israel, the very Shekinah glory of God, his dwelling presence, left the temple. It was left desolate, to connect it to Jesus' words in Matthew 23. Well, very interestingly, this happened in the year 592 BC, just prior to the destruction in 586. Notice, where did the glory of God go? It stood over the mountain which is east of the city. Well, where's that? Well, that's the Mount of Olives. That's the Mount of Olives. Well, where does Jesus go when he leaves the temple desolate in Matthew 23? The very next section, he's on the Mount of Olives. Where does Jesus ascend from? The Mount of Olives, just like the glory of God did some 500 years earlier. So in Ezekiel's day, because of the idolatry and unbelief of the people, the glory of Yahweh left. Now again, in Jesus' day, because of the idolatry and unbelief of the Israelites, Jesus, the glory of God, leaves. And where does he go? He goes to the Mount of Olives. It's the same pattern that happened some 590 years earlier. We should see that. We should make that connection. Okay, I'm making it for you if you haven't made it yourself. Okay, now, why is that important? Well, let me fast forward the slide here. This happened in 592 BC. The glory of God departed the temple and ascended from the Mount of Olives. Jesus does the same thing. 33 AD, Christ, the glory of God, departed the temple and went out to the Mount of Olives, from where he later ascends. Acts 1:11. Okay, remember Acts 1:11, he ascends from the Mount of Olives, just as the glory of God did in Ezekiel's day. Now, what you have to see, remember I mentioned Matthew 23:39, Jesus says, "You will not see me again until there's going to be a day that they will see him, but it's not until they say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" That is, they trust him as Messiah, that they recognize Jesus as the one whom they pierced is in fact the Messiah. Okay, so there's going to be a future return of the glory that is Christ himself to the temple. And so that's what Zechariah 14 depicts. Christ will return to the Mount of Olives. He sets his feet on it. This is at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. He'll destroy the enemy surrounding Jerusalem, and he's going to enter the temple. And we read about that, I believe, in Ezekiel 43. In fact, let me read to you Ezekiel 43. I've got that in my notes here. I've got, I believe, verses 3 through 5. Let me read to you Ezekiel 43, 3 through 5. It says this, it says, "And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city." Sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing this. It says, "And the visions were like the vision that I saw at the river Chebar," that was in Ezekiel chapter 10. And so I'm reading to you here Ezekiel 43, verses 3 through 5. Notice it says, he says, "And I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east." Stop there. Why is it the gate facing toward the east significant? Because to the east of Jerusalem is the Mount of Olives. Where does the Messiah return? In Zechariah 14:4, he sets his feet on the Mount of Olives. Okay, notice verse 5. I'm going to keep reading Ezekiel 43:5. I'm sorry, you probably can't see it. I'm looking at my notes. It says, "And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house." What I think Ezekiel 43 is referring to is the return of the Messiah. When he returns back, and he is in fact the very glory of God, and he takes his throne. Remember, he's kicked the Antichrist out, and he takes the throne, and he sits in the temple of God. Okay, he'll be reigning from Jerusalem at that point for 1,000 years. All right. Now, one more thing I want to cite to you, I think it's fairly interesting, is I want you to understand that this must be in the future. This has to be in the future. And let me read to you why. Notice here, Ezekiel 43:7, again, we're in this section. It says, he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever, and the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings by their harlotry. And he goes on. So here's the point. Forever, Yahweh is going to reign from this temple with the people of Israel, that is the Messiah, and no longer will they defile his name. Well, that obviously can't be something that has occurred yet in history. Okay, how many know that the Israelites today, who are all in unbelief, the vast majority of national ethnic Israel does not trust in the Messiah? So that means Isaiah 43:7 has never been fulfilled. Why? The only way not to defile God's holy name is coming to faith in Jesus. So Ezekiel 43:7 is depicting a day where they are in faith. Okay, well, that's never happened yet. All right, so this remains in the future, that one day the Messiah is going to return to the temple, just as Jesus said in Matthew 23:39, you will not see me again until, Haos, you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The one who comes in the name of the Lord is a messianic phrase, Genesis 49:10, Isaiah 59:20. It was built through history. And then it's Psalm 118:26, a messianic psalm that people would sing at the rebuilt temple. The expectation is one day Messiah is coming to this temple. That was their expectation. That's ultimately what it's about. Okay? That's how we come out of Matthew 23. Wow! Am I right? Is this loaded or what? And so that's how Jesus comes out of the temple. And where does he go? He goes to the Mount of Olives. The very glory of God, Christ himself, who is truly God, truly man, he leaves the temple and he's going to go to the Mount of Olives. That's where we start to pick it up in the next scene in Matthew 24, the Mount of Olives. And so if we're not picturing all the things that I just listed to you, we're missing it. We're not going to be interpreting the Olivet Discourse correctly. Okay, so with that, let's look at the Olivet Discourse, and I wanted to start the beginning of it. This is the setting scene. Okay, so notice here in Matthew 24, 1 through 3, Jesus came out from the temple. That's what we just read about. So the glory of God, again, Jesus is leaving the temple, just like what happened in 592 BC because of the idolatry of Israel. And he was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, dear ones, first of all, I want you to notice in red, Jesus predicts that not one stone would be left upon another that would not be torn down. Now, the reason the disciples think that that is, in fact, in the future, when Jesus has his parousia, his coming, is because the disciples are connecting the events of the destruction of the temple here, the stones not one left being upon another that aren't torn down, they're connecting that to the final battle when the nations surround Jerusalem in Zechariah 14. Why? Because of the setting on the Mount of Olives. Remember, Zechariah 14 has the final battle where the Messiah sets his feet on the Mount of Olives. As Jesus is telling them those things, where is he? It says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The connection they're making is Zechariah 14. Okay, let me show it to you. This is in their mind. Zechariah 14, 1 through 4. It says, behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you, that is from Israel, will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem. Stop there for just a moment. In 70 AD, it wasn't all the nations, it was one nation. And Yahweh didn't fight against those nations, I should say nation, in 70 AD. He allowed Rome to sack Jerusalem. But there's going to be a reversal in this battle. I'm pointing out that this can't be 70 AD. So he's going to gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. Notice the reference to the Mount of Olives. Where is Jesus sitting when he's engaged now in the Olivet Discourse? He's on the Mount of Olives. That's why it's called the Olivet Discourse. Okay, so the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. Obviously, that has not yet occurred. There has not been a split in that mountain. And I've heard some people, I don't know if it was a Christian geologist or someone involved with archaeology, they do claim that there's a fault line that does run through the Mount of Olives. Okay, now what I want to point out here, again, is that the gathering of the nations, plural, against Jerusalem has never occurred in 70 AD. It was one nation, and God did not fight against Rome. He allowed them to sack Jerusalem. This is going to be the opposite of that. Notice the connection that one day in this future battle, the Messiah's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. How did the glory of God return, or how is it predicted to return in Ezekiel 43? Remember, in Ezekiel chapter 10 through 11, the glory of the Lord departed from the Mount of Olives, or excuse me, from the temple to the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem, and then it went up. But in the later chapters of Ezekiel, like Ezekiel 43, we see he comes back in the same way. Well, that's exactly what's being depicted here. Now, also recall in Acts 1:11, as Jesus ascends bodily, remember, he's just given the instructions to his disciples. The disciples had asked him, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Acts 1:6. Jesus doesn't say, hey, where'd you guys get that goofy idea? No, he says, hey, it's not for you to know when. It's not for you to know the times and the epochs what are set in my Father's hand, but you're to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Well, in Acts 1:11, Jesus ascends bodily. And remember, there's two angels there. And the angels say to the disciples, men of Galilee, why do you gaze skyward? This same Jesus is coming back in like manner. That phrase, in like manner, in fact, it literally says, I think, in the same way that you saw him go into heaven. The way I cited it to you by memory, but I have it actually on the screen. It says he literally will come just the same way as you watched him go into heaven. In the same way means just that. Jesus ascended bodily. He's returning bodily. He ascended from the Mount of Olives. He's returning to the Mount of Olives. What is Zechariah 14:4 saying? His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Who is Jesus? Jesus is Yahweh. Jesus himself testified to that. John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. That's what he's declaring. So this is about Jesus returning to the Mount of Olives. That's what the disciples understand Jesus to be referring to because of the setting on the Mount of Olives. Okay? Now, notice the question. There's two questions the disciples are asking. The first is when. They say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what you'll find out as we go forward in interpreting the Olivet Discourse is these things in Matthew 24 are all about the 70th week of Daniel. They are not about the church age. They are not about what happened in 70 AD in any way. So if you're a note taker, jot down when it comes to these things, it's the 70th week of Daniel. They're literally asking, as you'll see filled out, tell us when will the 70th week of Daniel come and what will be the sign of your parousia. The parousia, as I've laid out earlier, is synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. I've showed you that in earlier messages. Okay? Now, notice they also ask, and of the end of the age. Some people think there's three questions. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And the end of the age. That's false. The disciples are assuming that the end of the age occurs at Jesus' parousia, at his coming. Why? Because then you're going to have the Messianic age. So it's really two questions. The question is, when will these things happen? And notice what's the other one? What will be the sign of your coming? And associated with that is the end of the age. So two questions. Why is that important? Because the entirety of the Olivet Discourse is structured by Jesus answering the second question first, where he will give you signs from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 35. But all of a sudden in verse 36, by way of a discourse marker in Greek, peride, he'll say, now let me answer the first question, when? Okay, what you're going to find out are all the signs are from Matthew 24, verse 4 through 35, because all the signs are about the signs inside the 70th week. But in verse 36, he begins to answer, when will the 70th week of Daniel come? And you have no idea. 4 or 5 different ways Jesus says no one knows. It's like a thief. It's like a master who's gone. You have no idea. That's what he says. Okay, so that's the basic layout. So let me explain then, I'm going to turn to the next slide here, how these discourses are compared. Remember, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they each have a form of the Olivet Discourse. What I'm going to show you is that Matthew and Mark are basically identical. Matthew has more material, but they're structured identically. But Luke is different, and let me explain why. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are only focused on the future coming of Christ. They have nothing to do with 70 AD. They're not interested in that per se. Okay, now, are there certain similarities? Yes, there are, but they're not focused in any way, and I'll prove it to you. Okay, I'm not just going to say it. Anything I say, I'll prove it to you biblically later. Okay, so Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are only focused on the future. If you're oscillating back and forth between 70 AD and the future, you're always going to get the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 wrong. You always will. Okay? Luke 21. Luke 21 is the other so-called Olivet Discourse. I'll explain why I don't even like calling it the Olivet Discourse per se. But notice here in Luke 21 focuses on 70 AD and the future. The future is the focus, but he does talk about 70 AD. Why? Because from Luke chapter 9, I think it's verse 51, all the way to the end of the book, it's about Jesus' travel narrative to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the place that murders the prophets. Okay? That's why, because they're the sons of those who murder the prophets, as Jesus said in Matthew 23:31. They're part of this generation. And so Luke has a real focus on Jerusalem itself in the 70 AD destruction. How do we know that Eric isn't just making this up? How do we know that Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are focused on the future, and Luke 21 is talking about the future, but also 70 AD? Because Luke 21 has something unique starting in verse 12. Let me show you. Luke 21:12, only Luke has this, where he says, but before all these things. Okay, but before all these things. Now, why is that important? Because in the Olivet Discourse in Luke, and again, I hesitate to even use Olivet Discourse, I'll explain why. But in Luke 21, all the way up to verse 11, Jesus is describing the future coming, which is still in our future, the 70th week of Daniel. But all of a sudden in verse 12, he says, but before all these things. Before all what things? Before the 70th week of Daniel. He all of a sudden takes you back to 70 AD. And he says, they will lay their hands on you, they will persecute you, delivering you over to the synagogues, prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. Well, if you take this all the way to verse 24, in verse 24, Jesus says that Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so from Luke 21:12 all the way to verse 24, Jesus is taking you through the church age or the time of the Gentiles. And then when you get to verse 25, he goes back to the 70th week of Daniel. Luke 21 is the only discourse that has this phrase, but before all these things. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are only focused on the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so let me say this again. A lot of people believe the Olivet Discourse is focused on 70 AD. They are not correct. They are not correct. Only Luke, from Luke 21:12 to 24, is focused on 70 AD. The rest of it is on the future 70th week of Daniel. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are only focused on the future 70th week of Daniel. Why is that important? Because Matthew's focus is on the parousia, the return of Christ. At the parousia, according to passages like 1 Thessalonians 4:15, 1 Corinthians 15:23, at the parousia is the resurrection. Did the resurrection happen in 70 AD? No. Matthew 24:21, Jesus says it's going to be the worst time period ever. Was the worst time period ever in 70 AD? Well, no. Okay, so again, Matthew 24, Mark 13 are focused on the 70th week of Daniel. Luke 21 is as well, but from Luke 21:12 to 24, he focuses on 70 AD. Okay, all right. Now, with that, I'm going to show you why. Different setting, different focus. Remember, Matthew 24, where's Jesus? He's on the Mount of Olives. In Mark 13:3, where is Jesus? He's on the Mount of Olives. Okay, let's go to Luke 21. Luke 21, here's the setting. It says, and while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones, notice, conspicuously absent is a reference to the Mount of Olives here. Okay, and in fact, if you go later in the discourse, Luke 21:37 through 38, it says, now during the day he was teaching in the temple, but at evening he would go and spend the night on the mount that is called Olivet. And all the people would get up early in the morning to come to him in the temple to listen to him. So here's the point. Luke doesn't set the same teaching at the Mount of Olives. And by the way, I'm not saying that there's a discrepancy between the two. There's not. I think Jesus taught this numerous times. Okay, for example, when you go to Luke 17:22 through 37, you'll see additional eschatological teaching in Luke that's also found in Matthew 24. So obviously Luke isn't concerned as much about the timing of when Jesus taught these things as Matthew and Mark are. And Jesus taught these things numerous times throughout his 3-year earthly ministry. Okay, so whether or not Luke records, for example, Luke 17, the eschatological teaching a different time that Jesus taught it, that's a whole nother matter. In other words, Jesus didn't just say these things one time and that was it. Like any good teacher, he gave repetition. So you'll see Luke 17 verses 22 through 37 talks about the same eschatological teaching that Matthew 24 does and Mark 13. And so it's added material to Luke 21. So there's a difference. The implication in Luke 21:37 and 38 is that Jesus was teaching in the temple. But the implication here, why? Because that's where he would teach during the day. It says that. Notice, and all the people would get up early in the morning to come to him in the temple to listen. It was during the day. Where was he during the day? He was teaching in the temple. Okay, but here in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, the setting is on the Mount of Olives. Again, Jesus taught this material multiple times. And if you doubt that, look at Luke 17 verses 22 through 37. Again, any good teacher doesn't just teach you very important doctrine just once and then say, okay, that's good enough. In fact, remember in Acts chapter 1, Jesus taught his disciples for 40 days about the kingdom of God. And I'm sure there was a lot of eschatology in there. These guys had the greatest seminary of all time. Okay, but that's the primary difference. And that's why Matthew and Mark are focused on the future. Why? The Mount of Olives connects you to Zechariah 14. In Luke, the implication is he was teaching in the temple. He was teaching in the temple. Okay, different setting, different focus. All right, now with that, let's talk about the structure. And here's where you're going to want to have this down. What I'm going to show you is something that was revolutionary to me some years ago. When I was challenged to understand eschatology by our church, I have to say I was ready to give up on pre-trib. I wasn't ready to give up on pre-mill because I knew the promises from the Old Testament. That much I had down. But what I couldn't understand was the Olivet Discourse. And so maybe you're like me. For many years I read it and I thought, well, how in the world can you have signs that you can know, and yet in one section of Matthew 24, you can't know. How can you reconcile knowing and not knowing at the same time in the same relationship? It seemed a contradiction. What I'm going to show you is there's a grammatical discourse marker that shows us the structure of the Olivet Discourse. If you get this down, eschatology is going to take off for you. If you don't understand this, it'll always be opaque to you. Okay, so let's show you how it works. Matthew 24, there was 2 questions the disciples asked, as I mentioned earlier. The first question was, when will these things happen? And again, they're assuming the parousia at the end of the age, the Zechariah 14 battle, they're only focused on the future. So that's the focus that Jesus is going to give them in Matthew 24. So first question, When will these things happen? Matthew 24:3a, that's the disciples' first question. Second question, what will be the sign of your coming? And remember, and the end of the age. But the end of the age was attached to the coming, and so it's really one question. Okay, so two questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? Jesus' answer is structured off of the question of the disciples. Okay, so what I'm showing you isn't Eric Dalma's hypothesis, just taking, just guessing, pulling something out of midair. I'm showing you evidence. Listen carefully. What Jesus does is he answers the second question first. Sometimes politicians do that, or we do that. People will ask us a couple of questions, and we'll say to them, hey, let me handle the second one first. That's exactly what Jesus did. So he begins from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 35 by answering the second question, what are the signs of your coming? And so he gives them sign after sign. From Matthew 24:4 through 8, it's about the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. There's going to be wars, there's going to be famines, pestilence, earthquakes, and then Jesus says in Matthew 24:8, these are the beginning of birth pangs. Birth pangs is a technical expression in Greek, odin, that refers to the day of the Lord. Meaning, the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel is the beginning of the day of the Lord. And why is it important that Jesus talks about wars and rumors of wars? A lot of people say, Eric, we've always had that. Not like these. Read it in Revelation chapter 6, verse 8. At the fourth seal, the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, what are you going to have? You're going to have a quarter of the earth's population die due to sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. That's exactly what Jesus is referring to in Matthew 24:4 through 8. Well, then what Jesus does from verse 9 all the way to verse 14 is he takes you to the end of the 70th week. But then by way of recapitulation, he brings you back in verse 15, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation at the midpoint, let the reader understand. He's talking about the 3.5-year mark in Daniel's 70th week. Well, then from Matthew 24:15 all the way to verse 29, he talks about the entirety of the Great Tribulation from the 3.5-year mark on. From Matthew 24:29 to verse 31, it's about that final battle that you have in Joel chapter 3, Zechariah 14, where the sun, moon, and stars will be darkened, and Jesus returns, where he's going to sit his feet on the Mount of Olives, and he establishes the kingdom to Israel. Okay, when you get to verse 35, Jesus will explain that heaven and earth will pass away, but his words never will. But all of a sudden, verse 36, he uses peri day. That's a discourse marker. It literally is rendered now concerning. And what that shows us at verse 36 is Jesus is now switching topics to answer the first question, when? So whereas Jesus was answering about inside the 70th week of Daniel here, all of a sudden now he focuses on the when question, and he's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. And that's why he says 4 or 5 different ways you can't know. No one knows the day or the hour. That's the shift that most people don't see. So the way this is structured, it's called a chiasm. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they are notorious for using chiasms. In fact, there's a huge chiasm in Luke in the travel narrative. It's like chapter after chapter. Kenneth Bailey has an example of it. The writers of the New Testament were far more brilliant than we are. They really were. These are people who could really write. And of course, they're inspired by the Spirit. So Jesus is, again, just answering the second question first. What are the signs of your coming? He answers that here, and all of the signs are inside the 70th week. When you come to Matthew 24:36 to 51, and by the way, it extends into chapter 25 as well, but we'll just focus on chapter 24 for now. He talks about the beginning of the 70th week, and you realize you can't know when it's going to begin. So if you're living inside the 70th week, you'll see signs. But if you wonder if you're living prior to the 70th week, there are no signs. There's no signs as to when the 70th week will come. But once you're in it, you'll see all sorts of signs. Well, what this is going to do is it's going to play into the timing of the rapture. Why? Because the rapture passage is here. It's at the beginning of the 70th week. It's Matthew 24:40, right after Jesus talks about the parousia comes like the days of Noah. What's the point of the days of Noah? Matthew 24:37 to 39 is that the people that it came upon, the unregenerate, they had no idea it was going to come. They were eating and they're drinking and they're giving in marriage until suddenly destruction came upon them. That's the way it's going to be at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. And then he shifts. He says there's going to be two men in the field. One will be taken, paralambano, received to Christ. The other will be a famine, abandoned to destruction like the temple was in Matthew 23:38. That's the rapture passage. Why is it here? Because this is the beginning. He's answering the when. When will the 70th week come? That's where he's answering it. If you don't get this structure down, you will never get, and I know this is bold, it seems arrogant, but you will never get the Olivet Discourse. And by the way, I'm not the only one who sees this structure. John Hart, great scholar from Moody Bible Institute, he sees it. There's many others. Okay, if you don't get this down, and what I would recommend is I would recommend writing this down. In fact, do it a few times. Write it down so that you can do it by heart on like a napkin. If you wanted to sit down and explain at a Perkins or a restaurant how the Olivet Discourse is structured, learn this. Have it memorized so that you can write this chiastic structure down just as I have it. Okay, we're going to get a theological workout. We're going to understand eschatology, and you're going to understand that inside the 70th week, tons of signs. Prior to the 70th week, the last 7 years, there's no signs. You have no idea when it's going to begin. And the very beginning of it is what? The rapture. The rapture, then the wrath of God comes. Dear ones, Noah and his family were removed in the ark. The wrath came. Lot and his family were removed, and the wrath came. That's Jesus' point in the eschatological teaching in Luke 17:26-30. Guess what? It's going to be the same way at the parousia. The people of God are removed, then the wrath comes. Okay, we're not reading into the text. We're reading what the text says. Let's be better readers. Let's learn. So again, dear ones, I'm excited about this. Okay, let's Mark 13. Mark 13 is structured the same way. When will these things be? Mark 13:4a. What will be the sign of when these things will be fulfilled? That's 13:4b. Jesus answers the second question first. The signs are all inside the 70th week. Mark 13:5-31. Then in verse 32, again, using peri-day, same discourse marker that you see in verse 36, Jesus then answers the first question. And all of a sudden you have no signs. You have no signs as to when the 70th week will come. It's identical. Matthew has more, but it's the same structure. Mark 13 is just more streamlined. Okay? Now, let's look at Luke. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. I don't remember actually what I had on this slide. I think I want to talk about mistakes to avoid here. That's obviously what's on the screen. I just added this slide here about 15 minutes prior. A lot of these messages I've had written, and I forget what's even on them. So let me talk about mistakes to avoid in Matthew 24. Let me put this up. This is the chiastic structure. What I want you to think about is the major mistake. Please don't glaze over. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. The major mistake that people make is they take the signs in Matthew 24, verse 4-35, and they either put them in 70 AD. You'll always be out in left field if you do that. How many times will you be wrong? You'll always be wrong. Was 70 AD the worst time period ever? Well, of course it wasn't. The 20th century was worse than that. You had 70 million murdered by Mao. More Jews died in Poland from 1939 to 1945 than died in 70 AD. And I'm not saying 70 AD was a cakewalk. It was horrific. What I'm saying is it's not the worst time period ever. And the 20th century wasn't either, because Revelation talks about things that have never come. A third of the Earth's planet being destroyed by a demonic horde. Revelation chapter 9, a third of the oceans turning to blood. You think if that happened in 70 AD, Josephus may have mentioned it. That's never happened. It's never happened during the church age. It's going to happen in the 70th week of Daniel. That's what this rascal's about. So if you take the signs in this section, you put them in 70 AD, how many times you're going to be wrong? You're always going to be wrong. You're always going to be out in left field. That's why I'm so apoplectic about it. They don't know what they're talking about. Now, let's say this is my biggest pet peeve. This is the people that are in my camp, pre-tribulationists like myself. If you hold to my view, how many times have you gone to a prophecy conference where prophecy teacher after prophecy teacher shows you the newspaper clippings? And they're saying, well, yeah, look at this and look at this. This must be this. Well, you know what? That's the church age. We're living in the church age. You and I are not in the 70th week of Daniel. How do I know that? Because we weren't raptured. Okay, we're not in the 70th week of Daniel. So these people keep showing you signs here and claiming from their newspaper clippings that they're happening here in the church age. That's wrong. How can you believe in an imminent rapture and yet believe that there are certain signs that have to come prior to it? That's the absurdity. But once you see the chiastic structure, that all of the signs are inside the 70th week. So look at the signs from Matthew 24, 4 through 35. They're all in here. Then when he answers the question, when, which is down here in Matthew 24, 36 or 51, no one knows. That's about the beginning of it. When does this whole rascal kick off, the 70th week? You have no idea. No one knows the day or the hour. No one knows when it's going to start. No one. Okay? It's an imminent event. The rapture is imminent. There's no signs prior. That's the 70th week. The kickoff to it is the rapture. That's why Jesus talks about it at the beginning of this section. Okay? So why do we have prophecy teachers at prophecy conferences saying, well, I saw, such and such happen in Israel and the Mideast, and this happened? They're trying to show you signs in the church age as if there's something to tip you off as to when this comes. Well, now all of a sudden, this isn't imminent. They claim to believe in imminence, and yet they're trying to claim that there's signs that have to happen prior. If there's some sign that must occur prior to the 70th week, it's not imminent. Okay, but once you realize all the signs, listen carefully. All of the signs are inside the 70th week of Daniel. All of a sudden you realize, wait a minute. Jesus answers from Matthew 24, 36, when does the 70th week come? And you have no idea. No one knows, not the angels of heaven. So why do I have prophecy teachers who claim to believe in imminence, giving you all these signs in the church age as if they're tipping you off to an event that you can't be tipped off for? Okay, so how can you get this wrong? You take the signs and you put them in 70 AD, or you take the signs and you put them in the church age. How do you get it right? You take the signs from Matthew 24, 4 to 35, and you put them in the 70th week of Daniel. And I'll prove to you that's where they belong. Why does Jesus say in Matthew 24, 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation? When is that? It's at the midpoint. That's a primary timing indicator. And it shows us that all of the signs are in the 70th week, the future day of the Lord. They're not in the church age. And so that's what baffles people. Okay, now let me leave you with this. I want to show you Luke real quick, and we'll close. I've thrown a lot at you, and I apologize to go so long. But let's look at Luke real quick, why he's a little different. Again, similar question. When will these things happen? The disciples ask. What will be the sign when these things will be fulfilled? Jesus begins answering, just like he does in Matthew and Mark, the signs in the 70th week of Daniel. It's the same, Luke 21, 8 through 11. But all of a sudden, because of his focus on Jerusalem as the place that rejects the prophets, he goes to 70 AD. And you know that because of verse 12, he says, but before all these things. And that's the key phrase, where all of a sudden he's taking you inside the time of the Gentiles. The 70th week of Daniel, and then after, all the way up until the 70th week of Daniel. So the entirety of the church age. So from Luke 21, 12 to 24, he takes you from 70 AD through the entirety of the church age. And remember, he says that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That happens, that reversal will come when the 70th week of Daniel comes. Okay, so all of a sudden, you get back to Luke 21, 25, right after verse 24, and now he's back to the future 70th week of Daniel. And he answers the second question. He's still answering the second question because it got broken up by his 70 AD discussion. So once you get to verse 33, he's done with the signs within the 70th week of Daniel. Then he reverts to answering the second question. When will these things happen? And Luke 21, 34 through 36, he answers that. He says, be careful that the day does not come upon you like a trap, meaning suddenly. Okay, so that's the structure I believe for Luke. Okay, again, dear ones, Matthew and Mark are focused only on the future. Luke is primarily focused on the future parousia, but he mixes in 70 AD and the times of the Gentiles from Luke 21, 12 through 24, as evidenced by he alone has the phrase, but before these things. This is the structure of the Olivet Discourse. And in the next messages I give you, I'll be proving it to you. I'll be laying it out for you. And I tell you what, you're in for an exciting time. You're in for understanding eschatology. I'm excited for you. And again, little homework for you. Keep reading. Matthew 24 is the Olivet Discourse we'll focus on. And if you would, learn how to, by heart, write down that chiastic structure. Be able to sit down at an Embers or a restaurant and be able to do it on a napkin. I mean, be able to do it at any time. That's how well you want to know that structure. Because once you know it, you'll never be confused again. All of a sudden, the Olivet Discourse is going to come alive. Brothers and sisters, I'm excited for you to learn the Olivet Discourse just like I did about 15 years ago in my research. And I'm excited to share it with you. I'm excited to see eschatology come alive in your life where you can say confidently, you know what, I know what this is saying. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I don't have to go into this error, that error, post-millennialism, amillennialism, preterism. You'll know that you know. And again, if we believe as evangelicals in something called the perspicuity of Scripture, the clarity of Scripture, are we going to be those who say, well, God muddled the ending? The rest of it's clear. He just didn't get the ending real clear. No. What's not clear is human thinking. The Scriptures are clear. Let's not be a bunch of postmoderns and say, well, who can know? No, we can know. And we must, because we're the people of God. We'll see you next time at End Times with Pastor Eric.